"Get her off my field." Colonel Reed said it loud enough for 200 soldiers to hear. He didn't look at her when he said it. That was the part that burned, not the words, but the dismissal. The way a man erases someone without the courtesy of eye contact. The laughter hit like a wave. Emily Carter stood in the center of that laughter and did not move, did not flinch, did not look at the ground. She looked directly at Colonel Reed and said in a voice that carried over every sound on that field, "Sir, I'd like to stay where I am." The laughter stopped. 3 generals leaned forward. Nobody had ever said that to Reed, not once, not in 31 years. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to our channel and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Colonel Marcus Reed dismissed Emily Carter in front of 200 soldiers was the same morning he made the worst professional mistake of his decorated career, and he would not understand that for another 72 hours. But Emily understood it immediately. She had been standing in the same spot for 4 minutes before Reed even acknowledged her presence. 4 minutes in which the soldiers around her had found 12 different ways to make clear that they did not consider her one of them. The whispers started before she reached the center of the field. They moved through the formation the way fire moves through dry grass, fast, low, unstoppable. That's the tactical specialist transfer. They sent us a librarian. How much you want to bet she's gone by Thursday? Emily heard every word. She was designed to hear things other people missed. That was precisely why she was standing on this field, in this compound, on this particular Tuesday morning, though no one around her knew that yet, and she had no intention of telling them. Fort Ravenwood Tactical Training Center was not the kind of place people chose to be transferred to. You were sent to Ravenwood when someone above you decided you were either worth developing or worth breaking. The soldiers who survived the program walked out as a different category of military professional. The ones who didn't survive left quietly with paperwork that described their departure in language designed to obscure what had actually happened to them. Emily had read every available report on Ravenwood before she arrived. She had studied the success rate, the methodology, the psychological profile of Colonel Reed's training philosophy. She had read between the lines of the documents that were available to her and made educated guesses about the ones that weren't. She knew what she was walking into. What Ravenwood did not know was what it was walking into. Colonel Marcus Reed was 53 years old and had spent 31 of those years building a reputation that preceded him into every room he entered. He was barrel-chested, economical with words, and possessed of the particular kind of authority that comes not from rank alone, but from a consistent, unbroken record of being right. His soldiers respected him the way soldiers respect someone who has proven repeatedly that following his judgment keeps you alive. That was not a small thing. That was in many environments the only thing that mattered. He looked at Emily the way a man looks at something placed on his desk without his permission. "Lieutenant Carter." He said it without warmth, without curiosity, without any inflection that suggested her presence registered as significant. "You're the transfer from the Thornfield Analysis Division." "Yes, sir." "Analysis." He said the word the way some men say the word paperwork. "You have field experience." "Yes, sir." "How much?" She met his eyes. "Enough, sir." Something shifted in Reed's expression. Not respect, not yet, not even close, but something more like the slight recalibration of a man who expected an answer and received a different one. He filed it away. He turned back to the formation. "Move her to the back. She'll slow the formation down." And that was when the laughter came. It was not small private laughter. It was the laughter of 200 people who had been given permission by the most powerful man on the field to release what they were already thinking. It was relief. It was confirmation. It was 200 soldiers deciding simultaneously that they had been right about her from the moment she walked through the gate. Emily stood in it. She did not smile. She did not react. She catalogued it. The faces, the voices, the ones who laughed loudest, the ones who only smiled, the 2 or 3 near the left flank, who didn't react at all, and whose stillness she noted with particular interest. Then she said it. "Sir, with respect, I'd like to stay where I am." The laughter stopped the way water stops when you turn off a tap. Immediate. Complete. Colonel Reed turned back slowly. Around him, 200 soldiers had gone very still, because in 31 years, no one had absorbed a public dismissal from Colonel Marcus Reed and then politely declined to accept it. That was not how Ravenwood worked. That was not how anything worked. Reed studied her for a long moment. "That wasn't a suggestion, Lieutenant." "I understand that, sir." Her voice was steady, not defiant, not aggressive. Steady the way a table is steady, not because it's performing stability, but because it simply is. "But the formation position you've assigned places me behind Sergeant Kowalski's unit, which means in a live exercise scenario, any communication relay between the eastern flank and tactical command passes through me last. That's a 4 to 6 second delay in time-sensitive decisions. I'd rather be positioned where I'm most useful, sir." Silence. Colonel Reed stared at her. Behind him, a soldier named Sergeant First Class Dominic Hargrove, who had been at Ravenwood for 3 years, and who had heard every variation of confident speech a new transfer had ever attempted, felt something he could not immediately name. It was not respect. It was something more like the sensation of watching a chess player make a move you hadn't seen coming, and then realizing you needed to think several moves ahead before you understood why they made it. Reed said nothing for 4 full seconds. Then he said, "You'll take position 7. Position 7 was the center of the formation. It was a position reserved for candidates Reed expected to watch closely. The laughter did not return. But the resentment did quieter now, and harder the way resentment always becomes when it stops being confident. The 3 generals arrived at 9 o'clock. General Thomas Walker was 61 and carried his age the way old mountains carry weather visibly permanently without apology. He had commanded operations on 3 continents and was currently serving as the senior oversight officer for the Ravenwood evaluation cycle. He had approved over 200 graduates from this program and personally rejected 43 who had completed the full training sequence, but whom he determined were not ready for the responsibilities the graduation represented. General Olivia Hayes was 58 and was the kind of woman who made other people feel slightly behind. She processed information at a speed that her staff had learned to accommodate rather than match, and she had the disconcerting habit of asking questions that sounded simple until you tried to answer them. She had requested a transfer to Fort Ravenwood's evaluation board after reviewing the previous cycle's graduation data and identifying 3 specific patterns in the program's outcomes that she believed deserved direct examination. General Richard Mason was 56 and had spent the first half of his career in special operations and the second half in strategic intelligence. He was the quietest of the 3 and the one whose attention when it landed on you felt like something physical. He rarely spoke in meetings, and when he did, people tended to stop whatever else they were doing. They arrived together, took their positions at the observation platform above the main field, and began watching. Emily was aware of them from the moment they appeared. She did not look at them directly. Doing so would have telegraphed too much. But she logged their positioning, their posture, the particular quality of attention each of them brought to the field below. She had read what was available on all 3 of them. She knew what they were looking for, or at least what they believed they were looking for. She knew that the difference between what evaluators thought they were measuring and what they were actually measuring was often the most important gap in any assessment. Colonel Reed began the morning briefing. This evaluation cycle runs 72 hours. You will be assessed on tactical reasoning, team leadership, resource management, and decision-making under conditions of incomplete information. He scanned the formation. His eyes stopped briefly on Emily, then moved on. There are no second attempts. There are no extensions. If you cannot perform when it matters, you will not be here at the end of this cycle. That is all. A sergeant named Marcus Webb leaned toward the soldier beside him and said just loud enough to carry, 72 hours. I give the new girl 48. Generous estimate. Emily, 4 feet away, turned and looked at him directly. Webb met her eyes. He expected to see discomfort. He expected to see the particular expression of someone who had heard something unkind and was deciding how to absorb it. He saw something else. She looked at him the way someone looks at a problem they've already solved. Not unkindly. Not with contempt. With a kind of patient, settled certainty that made him feel for a reason he couldn't explain slightly off balance. She said nothing. She turned back to the front. Webb didn't say anything else. The first exercise was called a terrain assessment protocol, 16 teams. Each team had 45 minutes to analyze a simulated operational environment, identify critical vulnerabilities, and submit a tactical recommendation to command. The assessment was designed not to test whether candidates reached the right conclusion. There was rarely a single right conclusion, but to test the quality of their reasoning, the comprehensiveness of their analysis, and the coherence between their observations and their recommendations. Emily's team was Team 9. She had been placed there by Colonel Reed's assignment, and the 6 soldiers she was paired with received the news with varying degrees of visible enthusiasm, which is to say, none of them had any. Sergeant First Class Dominic Hargrove was the senior member of the team and had already decided internally that he would simply work around her. Corporal Dana Reyes had said nothing but had exchanged a look with Private First Class Kowalski that communicated everything neither of them wanted to say out loud. Private First Class Kowalski had in fact laughed when Reed made the formation comment. He was not proud of this, but he had not yet examined why. Specialist Aaron Chen was the youngest member of the team and the only one who had not yet formed a strong opinion. He tended to reserve judgment until he had data. This was a quality Emily would notice within the first 10 minutes. Sergeant Lena Voss and Corporal James Ortega completed the team. Voss had said to Ortega before the briefing ended, "If she gives me a bad evaluation cycle because command wanted to run some kind of diversity experiment, I am going to be very unhappy." Ortega had nodded, though, without strong conviction, because something about the new transfer's behavior on the field had made him uncertain in a way he couldn't articulate. When Team 9 convened at their assigned position, Hargrove immediately stepped forward. "I'll take point on the assessment. Everyone pull your data sets." He glanced at Emily. "Carter, you can take the communication log." The communication log was clerical work. Everyone knew it. Emily said, "I'll take the log, but I'd like 5 minutes to review the terrain data first if that's acceptable." Hargrove blinked. "We've got 45 minutes total, Lieutenant. We don't have time for—" 4 minutes and 50 seconds now, Emily said. "I'll be brief." She pulled up the terrain display and went quiet. For the next 4 minutes, while the rest of Team 9 began organizing their approach with the speed and confidence of people who had run similar exercises many times, Emily did not move. She stood in front of the terrain data and studied it with a stillness that Specialist Chen, watching from the side, found strangely compelling. She wasn't scrolling. She wasn't pulling statistics. She was reading the landscape the way a musician reads a score, looking not at individual notes, but at the shape of the whole thing. Reyes muttered to Kowalski, "She's doing nothing." Kowalski shrugged. "Give her 30 more seconds before we give up on her entirely." Emily said without turning around, "The assessment data is wrong." Everyone stopped. Hargrove turned slowly. "Excuse me, the grid reference for the primary crossing point is off by 200 meters. She pointed at the screen. "See the elevation marker here? It puts the crossing at a grade of approximately 12%. That's not crossable by a standard vehicle unit in the time frame the simulation is using. The actual viable crossing is here." She pointed to a different location. "The data was input incorrectly, or this is a test within the test." Silence. Hargrove stepped forward and looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "How did you—" "Elevation data doesn't match the weather report from the same sector. If the terrain profile were accurate, the water runoff pattern would look different." She turned around and looked at the team. "If we build our recommendation on the original crossing point, we get the right answer to the wrong question. If we build it on the actual crossing, we get the right answer to the right question. Reyes was staring at her. Kowalski had forgotten briefly that he had laughed at her 40 minutes ago. Hargrove said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then, Chen verified the elevation cross-reference. Chen verified it. She's right, he said. The primary crossing data is off. The alternate point is here. He looked up. If every other team uses the standard data, they're all going to submit the same wrong answer. Hargrove looked at Emily. Emily looked back at him. 4 minutes, she said. Still have 41 left. On the observation platform, General Olivia Hayes had stopped typing. She had been making notes on every team, the standard observational shorthand she had developed over 15 years of evaluation work, when something in her peripheral vision shifted. She had looked up and watched Team 9's body language change. She could not hear what was being said, but she could read the architecture of a conversation from posture alone, and what she was watching was the moment a group of people who had already made a decision about someone were being forced to unmake it. She said quietly to General Walker beside her, "Who is that?" Walker glanced down. "Team 9, that's the Thornfield transfer, Carter." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Pull her file." Walker looked at her. "It's sealed above our clearance level." Hayes turned to him. "I know. Pull it anyway." Team 9 submitted their recommendation with 11 minutes to spare. It was the only submission in the exercise that identified the data error and built its analysis around the correct terrain profile. When Colonel Reed reviewed the submissions, he read Team 9's report twice. Then he read it a third time. He had built this exercise himself. He had introduced the terrain data discrepancy deliberately 2 years ago as a component. He had never told anyone about a secondary layer designed to identify the rare candidate who looked past the surface of the problem and questioned the assumptions built into the question itself. In 2 years, no team had caught it. He looked up from the report and found Emily Carter standing in formation with the rest of Team 9, saying nothing, giving nothing away. He felt something he had not expected to feel this early in the cycle. He felt interested. He would not say that out loud. He would say it to no one. But he filed it in the part of his mind where he kept the things that mattered, and he moved to the next phase of the evaluation. The afternoon exercise was designed to break what the morning exercise had built. It was called a pressure rotation, a series of rapid-fire decision scenarios run individually without a team, without a support structure, without the benefit of another person's judgment, or a data set you could analyze at your own pace. Just you, a problem, a clock, and an observer. The problems were not solvable. That was the point. They were constructed with enough competing variables and insufficient information that no answer was technically correct, and the evaluation was entirely about how you reasoned through an impossible situation. What you prioritized, what you discarded, how you communicated your logic, and whether you could maintain coherent thought when the floor disappeared from under you. Sergeant Webb went first. He was confident, fast, decisive. He moved through the scenarios with the swagger of someone who had survived many difficult things and expected this to be another one. He scored reasonably well on speed. His reasoning had gaps he didn't know were there. Hargrove went fourth. He was thorough, careful, slower than the evaluators wanted. His answers were solid where the information allowed solid answers and honest about uncertainty where it didn't. He scored well overall. Emily went 12th. The observer for her rotation was a major named Lawrence Tate, who had run over 300 individual pressure evaluations, and who had, if he was honest, been looking forward to this particular one since he heard the story about the formation comment. Tate was not the kind of man who enjoyed watching people fail. But he was the kind of man who enjoyed watching things that were interesting, and this felt like it might be interesting. The first scenario was a resource allocation problem. A supply chain failure had compromised the ability of 2 separate units to complete their objectives. Both units needed the same resource. There was enough for one. The 2 commanders represented were a senior officer with a direct line mission and a junior officer running a support operation that, if the resource was pulled, would leave a 3rd unit vulnerable. Most candidates prioritized seniority and directness of mission. Some tried to split the resource. A few asked clarifying questions that the protocol did not allow. Emily read the scenario in 12 seconds. Then she said, "Neither." Tate looked up from his notes. "I'm sorry. Allocating to either unit as described produces a net loss. The senior mission fails without full support. Splitting the resource produces 2 partial failures instead of 1 complete one. The correct answer is to delay the senior mission by 4 hours, use that window to complete the support operation, and restore full resource availability before the senior mission launches." Tate stared at her. "The scenario doesn't include a delay option." "No, it doesn't." She met his eyes. "That's why the scenario is designed the way it is. The real test isn't the resource allocation. It's whether the candidate is willing to reject the framing of the problem when the framing is the problem." Tate set down his pen. He had been running pressure evaluations for 11 years. He had never had a candidate say that. He gave her the second scenario. By the time the evening briefing arrived, something had shifted at Fort Ravenwood that didn't have a name yet, but that everyone could feel. It was the particular kind of shift that happens when a group of people who share a common assumption begin to notice collectively that the assumption may have been wrong and then immediately pull away from that noticing, because accepting it requires acknowledging something uncomfortable about themselves. Sergeant Webb was in the mess hall when Corporal Reyes sat down across from him. "You hear about the terrain data thing this morning?" she asked. "The data error. She caught it before anyone else, 41 minutes before the submission deadline." Reyes looked at her food. "Every other team submitted the wrong answer. 15 out of 16 teams." Webb was quiet. "And in the pressure rotation." Reyes stopped. "What?" Tate gave her 6 scenarios. "Standard rotation is 5. He kept going." Webb put down his fork. "Why?" Reyes shook her head. He wanted to see how far it went. In the corner of the mess hall, Specialist Chen sat alone and turned over in his mind what he had watched that morning. He was 23 years old and had not yet developed the professional defensiveness that would eventually allow him to observe something remarkable without being genuinely changed by it. He was still young enough that what he had seen simply registered as real. He thought about the 4 minutes of stillness, the way she had looked at the terrain data without moving, the way she had not been frozen or hesitant, but had been somehow fully present and fully active while appearing to do nothing at all. He thought, "I have never seen anyone think like that before." He did not say this to anyone. At 2100, Colonel Reed sat in his office with the sealed file request that General Hayes had submitted through Walker. He looked at it for a long time. He had known when he accepted this transfer that the file was sealed. He had known the broad outlines Thornfield Analytical Unit classified work. He had not been given specifics and had not pushed for them because Ravenwood's evaluation process was designed to assess what people could do in front of you, not what their paperwork said about what they'd done elsewhere. He believed genuinely that this was the right methodology. But sitting in his office at 2100 with Hayes's file request and the afternoon's evaluation data spread across his desk, he felt the first faint pressure of uncertainty. He thought about the terrain data catch. He thought about what Tate had told him after the pressure rotation. He thought about the moment on the field that morning, when Emily Carter had absorbed his public dismissal and responded not with anger, not with deflection, not with the particular kind of wounded dignity that most people performed in that situation, but with a calm, practical argument about communication, relay timing, that had, if he was honest with himself, been entirely correct. He thought, "I moved her to position 7 because I wanted to watch her." He thought, "I told myself it was standard evaluation positioning." He thought it wasn't. He reached for the file request. He made a call. In the barracks, Emily Carter sat on the edge of her bunk in the dark and reviewed the day. She did this every night, had done it since she was 19 years old, and a mentor she respected had told her, "The day isn't finished until you've finished it honestly." Not generously, not harshly. Honestly. She went through each moment in sequence. The formation. The mess hall exchange she had ignored. Hargrove's initial decision to sideline her and the 4 minutes she had taken anyway. The terrain data. Tate's sixth scenario, which she had not fully anticipated, but which she had navigated by the same principle she applied to everything. Don't answer the question you're given. Answer the question underneath the question. She thought about the three generals. She had felt Hayes's attention shift during the morning exercise. She didn't know what Hayes was thinking, but she knew the quality of attention Hayes brought to observation was different from Walker's and Mason's more clinical, more pattern-based, looking for something structural rather than individual. She thought about Reed. Reed was the variable she had the least certainty about. He was not what she had expected. His dismissal of her this morning had been genuine, not performative. He wasn't playing to the crowd. He was making an actual assessment based on what he had in front of him, and what he had in front of him had not given him any reason to conclude otherwise. That was worth understanding. A man who dismisses you because he genuinely doesn't know better is a different problem than a man who dismisses you because he doesn't want to know better. Reed didn't know better yet. That was fixable. She lay back and looked at the ceiling. Tomorrow was the team command exercise. She thought about Hargrove, who had watched her in the mess hall tonight, with an expression she recognized as the face of a good soldier recalibrating. About Reyes, who was clearly smart and competitive, and who would either become her strongest ally or her most uncomfortable opponent, depending entirely on whether Reyes's intelligence ran faster than her pride. About Chen, who was young and open in a way that wouldn't last, but was precious while it did. About Webb, who had laughed the loudest this morning, and had gone quiet in the mess hall tonight. She thought, people are not what they show you first. She thought, neither am I. She closed her eyes. She had 71 hours left in the evaluation cycle. She had already decided how she was going to use them. But the decision she'd made wasn't what anyone at Fort Ravenwood expected. She wasn't there to win the evaluation. She was there to change what the evaluation measured. And the difference between those two things was going to cost someone something before this was over. She wasn't yet certain it wouldn't cost her. The team command exercise began at 0600, and by 0612, Sergeant First Class Dominic Hargrove had already made the decision that would define the next 8 hours of his career. He pulled Emily aside before the team assembled. "Yesterday was good work," he said. The words came out measured careful, like a man paying a debt he hadn't expected to owe. "The terrain data catch. I want you to know I'm not the kind of person who doesn't acknowledge that." Emily looked at him. "I know you're not." Hargrove blinked. He hadn't expected that. "You don't know me. You verified Chen's cross-reference before you trusted my conclusion," she said. "A man who didn't care about being right wouldn't have bothered. He would have just moved forward with what I told him and taken the credit if it worked." She paused. "You wanted to know if it was true. That tells me something." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "Today's different from yesterday," he said. "Yesterday was analysis. Today is command. That means decisions in real time under fire with people looking at you for answers you might not have." He looked at her directly. "I'm not asking you to follow my lead because I outrank you. I'm asking because I've run this exercise before and I know where the breaking points are." "Tell me where they are," Emily said. Hargrove paused. He had expected resistance. He had prepared without quite admitting it to himself a version of this conversation that involved more friction. The second phase has a communication blackout built into the scenario. 15 minutes where you lose contact with command and have to hold position or advance based entirely on your last known information. Most teams fall apart in the blackout. They either freeze or they improvise badly. "What did you do the last time you ran it?" "I froze," Hargrove said. "Just like that. No softening, no explanation. I froze for 40 seconds and it cost my team the secondary objective." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "Then today," she said. "When the blackout hits, you make the call and I'll tell you if the math supports it. Not before. Not in a way that undermines you in front of the team, just between us as fast as I can read the situation." She held out her hand. Deal. He took it. Deal. Neither of them noticed that Specialist Chen had been standing 6 feet away and had heard the entire exchange. Chen turned it over in his mind as the team assembled. He had watched two people who had every reason to compete decide instead to function. He was young enough that this struck him as remarkable rather than obvious, and old enough to understand that it wasn't guaranteed. When the full team gathered, Sergeant Voss immediately asked, "Who's running point today?" Hargrove said, "I am." Reyes looked at Emily. Emily looked back at Reyes with an expression that gave nothing away and offered nothing for Reyes to push against. Reyes nodded once, slowly. Fine. But it wasn't fine. Reyes would process that for the next 2 hours before she reached a conclusion about it, and the conclusion when it came would surprise her. The exercise launched at 06:30 sharp. The scenario: a degraded operational environment, partial intelligence, 3 simultaneous objectives at separate locations, and a team of 6 people who had to determine in real time, with limited communication, which objectives were real and which were fabricated to drain resources. Command would feed information. Some of it would be accurate, some of it would be deliberate misinformation seeded into the data stream. The team had to complete at least 2 of the 3 objectives within 4 hours. Colonel Reed observed from the command platform above. Behind him, Major Tate had positioned himself slightly apart from the other observers. He was watching Team 9 with the focused attention of someone who had revised his expectations overnight and was now waiting to see whether the revision had been sufficient. On the far end of the platform, General Olivia Hayes stood with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched and her eyes on the field below. The exercise opened with a cascade of incoming information reports, coordinates, status updates from simulated forward units. Most teams hit this phase and immediately began sorting real or false priority or secondary act, now or hold. Emily went still. This was the thing about her that the team was still learning to read. The stillness wasn't inaction. It was the opposite of inaction. It was the way she compressed her processing. No movement, no output. Everything internal, until she had enough of a picture to act on. Hargrove had learned to recognize it in 12 hours. He gave her 15 seconds. At second 14, she said, "The third objective is a ghost." Ortega looked up from his data. "The supply depot recovery that's listed as Priority 1. It's listed as Priority 1 because whoever designed this scenario knows that Priority 1 labeling will pull at least half the available teams toward it within the first 20 minutes. She pointed at a sequence in the incoming data without touching the screen. "Look at the confirmation timestamp on the depot's last status update. It's 47 minutes ahead of the scenario start time. This scenario runs in real time. A status update can't exist before the scenario begins." Chen checked it. "She's right," he said, and his voice had taken on a quality it hadn't had yesterday, not just confirmation, but the voice of someone who had started to trust the direction he was looking in. Hargrove made the call. "We pull the depot off the priority list. Focus on objectives 1 and 2. Reyes, what's your read on the Eastern Corridor intelligence?" Reyes had been watching Emily rather than her data screen, and she pulled herself back to the task with a small jolt of self-correction. The Eastern Corridor report has 2 conflicting grid references for the same position. The first version was transmitted 11 minutes before the second. If both are in the system simultaneously, someone wanted us to see the conflict. Or, Emily said, someone made a genuine error and then corrected it without removing the original. Reyes looked at her. "You're arguing against your own logic." "I'm arguing that we shouldn't fall in love with our conclusions before we have enough information to deserve them." Emily turned to Hargrove. "We need 30 more seconds of incoming data before we can determine which version of the corridor report is deliberate and which is accidental. The difference matters because it changes our approach to Objective 1 by approximately 40 minutes. Hargrove nodded. 30 seconds. Everyone hold." Webb, who had said nothing since the exercise began, was watching Emily with an expression that had been quietly evolving for 12 hours. He was not a complicated man, he would have told you this himself with some pride, but he was a precise one. He knew what he knew, and he knew what he didn't know, and what he was discovering was that the category of things he didn't know was slightly larger than he had recently believed. He said, "For what it's worth, the 30-second hold is right. I ran a version of this exercise 8 months ago. The data stream in the first phase always includes at least one deliberate conflict designed to reward patience." Emily looked at him. He met her eyes, held them, did not look away. It was the first thing he had said directly to her that wasn't edged with dismissal. She nodded. Good to know. That was all. But something in the economy of it. No performance of reconciliation, no excess warmth, just received, noted, respected, landed in web with more weight than an elaborate response would have. At second 28, the data stream delivered a third transmission. Emily read it and said, "The first corridor report is the error. The second is the correction. We go with the second." She looked at Hargrove. Objective 1 via the northern approach. It adds 12 minutes to the timeline, but removes the exposure risk in the eastern position, which the scenario will almost certainly exploit if we use it. Hargrove looked at her. Then he looked at his own read of the data, which had been trending toward the same conclusion, but hadn't arrived there yet. "Agreed," he said. "Northern approach. Move." Team 9 moved. Above them, General Hayes finally took a sip of her coffee. "She's pattern reading the scenario in real time," she said quietly to no one in particular. General Mason, who had been standing 2 feet to her left for the past 40 minutes in perfect silence, said, "She's been doing it since yesterday morning." Hayes turned to look at him. In 30 years of working alongside Mason, she had learned that when he volunteered an observation, it was worth treating as the most important thing he would say for the next several hours. "You've seen this before?" she asked. "Once," Mason said. "One other time." He didn't elaborate. Hayes decided not to push. She turned back to the field and kept watching. The first hour of the exercise was a controlled grind. Team 9 moved through their objectives with a precision that drew attention. Not through speed. They were not the fastest team on the field, but through the quality of their positioning, the absence of wasted motion, and the way their communication had settled into a rhythm that looked from above less like 6 people running a training exercise and more like a single organism making decisions. This was not an accident. It was the result of something Emily had done in the first 20 minutes that none of the team had consciously registered as a deliberate act. She had learned each person's processing pattern and adjusted how she communicated with each of them accordingly. With Hargrove, she spoke in options. "Here are the 2 viable paths. You choose." He was a man who made better decisions when he felt the weight of agency, and she gave him that weight deliberately, even when she already knew which path she would have taken. With Chen, she spoke in problems. "Here is the anomaly I'm seeing. What do you make of it?" He was young and sharp and needed to feel that his thinking was part of the process, rather than being outpaced by hers. He worked faster and more accurately when the question was put to him than when the answer was given. With Reyes, she spoke sideways. Not directives, not questions, but observations made to the air in front of her that Reyes could pick up and claim as her own deduction. Reyes was competitive in the way that highly intelligent people with something to prove are competitive. She would resist being led, but she would run hard in any direction she had decided herself. So Emily gave her the direction without the instruction. With Webb, she spoke plainly. Facts, short sentences, no subtext. He trusted directness because directness was his own language, and he was beginning, she could feel it, to trust her. With Voss and Ortega, she watched. Voss was capable, controlled, and deeply invested in the team's success in a way that had nothing to do with individual recognition. She wanted the outcome. She would subordinate herself entirely to any process that produced the outcome. Emily filed this as the most powerful resource on the team, and the one she had not yet found the right way to use. Ortega was steadier than he appeared. He had a gift for logistics, for knowing where things were and where things needed to be, and how much time the gap between those 2 points would consume. He had not been asked to apply that gift in a context that recognized it, and the result was that he was quietly underperforming in ways that frustrated him and bewildered his supervisors. Emily noted this. She would come back to it. At 08:42, the communication blackout hit. It came without warning. That was the design. 15 minutes of complete silence from command, during which Team 9 was sitting on the edge of a decision point that required information they no longer had access to. The team stopped. Hargrove felt it the freeze. The same freeze that had cost him the secondary objective last time. It was not fear exactly. It was the sensation of being asked to make a permanent decision with temporary information and the terrible knowledge that whatever you chose in the next 60 seconds would still be true after the blackout lifted. He turned to Emily. She was already looking at him. She said quietly just to him, "The last confirmed data we had put the secondary team at position 47 Alpha. Their objective had a 30-minute completion window. Blackout hit at minute 18. If they're on schedule, they're still running. If they've completed early, they've pulled back to the rally point." She paused. "The question is whether we move to support them and risk arriving after they've already pulled back, or hold position and risk them needing support they won't get," Hargrove breathed. "Which do you think?" "I think they're on schedule," she said. "The scenario is designed to test patience, not intervention. The blackout is the test. The right answer is to hold and trust the process." "What if you're wrong?" "Then I'm wrong," she said. "And we deal with what comes next. But I'm not wrong." A beat of silence. Hargrove looked at the team. 6 faces looking back at him, waiting. He said, "We hold." Webb opened his mouth. Hargrove said, "We hold Webb." Webb closed his mouth. 13 minutes and 40 seconds of silence. The communication channel reopened at minute 15 exactly. The secondary team had completed their objective on schedule and pulled back to the rally point 7 minutes ago. They had needed nothing. Holding had been right. Voss let out a long breath that had been building for 14 minutes. Reyes said nothing, but she put her data tablet down on the console with more care than was strictly necessary, which was her version of emotional release. Chen said, "How did you know they were on schedule?" Emily said, "I didn't know. I assessed. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Knowing means certainty. Assessing means you've worked with the best information available and made the most defensible decision possible given what you have. You'll never have certainty in this environment. Anyone who tells you they were certain was either lying to you or lying to themselves." She looked at him. "The goal isn't to eliminate doubt. The goal is to make good decisions in spite of it." Chen thought about this for the rest of the exercise. He thought about it, if he was honest, for considerably longer than that. The exercise hit its breaking point at the 0940 mark, the moment that Colonel Reed, watching from above, had privately designated as the architecture point. The place where the scenario delivered its real test, disguised as an administrative complication. A 4th objective appeared in the data stream, unscheduled, unmarked as priority, delivered with the kind of bureaucratic neutrality that suggested it was routine, a supplemental recovery task, medium urgency, a position 12 minutes off their current route. 5 of the 6 teams still active in the exercise immediately moved toward it. The 6th team was Team 9. They didn't move, because Emily had gone still again. "Give me 60 seconds, she said. Hargrove had stopped questioning the 60-second requests. "Clock's running." She read the 4th objective's data packet with the focused attention of someone who had trained themselves to be suspicious of things that arrived at convenient times. The objective had appeared at the precise moment Team 9 had locked in their approach to the final primary objective. 12 minutes off route meant 12 minutes added to their timeline, which meant she ran it a 17% reduction in their buffer before the exercise end state. But the bigger problem wasn't the timeline. The bigger problem was the phrasing. "Medium urgency," she said out loud to herself. Reyes heard it. "What about it?" In this scenario, every other urgency designation has been either Priority 1, Priority 2, or Secondary Support. Those are the 3 tiers the scenario uses. Medium urgency isn't a tier in this scenario's framework. She looked up. It's not language from this exercise. It's generic language dropped into a specific system. Someone generated this objective outside the scenario parameters and inserted it. Ortega's head came up. Why would someone insert a false objective outside the scenario framework? Because a false objective inside the framework can be caught by checking internal consistency. A false objective from outside the framework can only be caught by knowing the framework well enough to recognize what doesn't belong in it. The team was very quiet. Are you saying, Webb said slowly, that this is a test within the test again? I'm saying that two tests within one test is either a design choice or a coincidence, and in a program designed and run by Colonel Marcus Reed, I don't believe in coincidences. On the command platform, Colonel Reed had gone very still. He looked at Tate. Tate looked back at him with an expression that said, yes, she found it. The fourth objective was not part of the official scenario. It was Reed's own addition, something he had inserted into this evaluation cycle. For the first time, something he had not shared with the three generals or the other evaluators. A private test within the official test that he had designed specifically to see whether any candidate in this cycle was capable of identifying it. He had not expected anyone to find it in the first cycle. He had not expected anyone to find it at all. He looked down at Team 9, who had not moved, and at the small figure at the center of the group who had gone still and come back with the right answer. He felt the thing he had been resisting since yesterday morning arrive with a force that made resistance useless. Not just interest. Recognition. He was looking at someone who thought the way he thought. Not the same content, not the same methods, but the same architecture. The same fundamental refusal to accept the surface of a problem as the problem itself, the same instinct to look for the frame before engaging with the picture inside it. He had spent 31 years looking for that. He had not expected to find it in a transfer from Thornfield he'd dismissed in front of 200 soldiers on a Tuesday morning. He picked up his radio. He called the evaluation control room. He said quietly, "Lock the fourth objective. Confirm Team 9's assessment was correct." The control room operator said, "Confirmed, sir. They're the only team to flag it." Reed set down the radio. He did not say anything else, but he reached into the folder beside him and pulled out the restricted file request General Hayes had submitted last night, the one requiring clearances above his own, and he looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked up a different phone, one that connected to a line most Fort Ravenwood personnel didn't know existed. He made a call. He said, "This is Colonel Reed at Ravenwood. I need to talk to someone about the Thornfield file, the Carter transfer." A pause. "No, not tomorrow. Tonight." Below him, Team 9 completed their primary objectives with 14 minutes to spare and 0 deviation from Emily's adjusted northern approach route. They were the second team to finish. The first team finished 3 minutes earlier, but had spent 11 of those minutes chasing the false fourth objective before abandoning it, which meant their official objective completion was actually slower than Team 9's. In the mess hall debrief, Reed announced this without editorial. He simply stated the completion times, the objective scores, the resource utilization rates. He did not mention the fourth objective. He did not say who had found it. He didn't need to. The teams who had chased it were already doing the math. Sergeant Webb sat in the mess hall that evening and looked at his food and tried to work out what he was feeling. It was not a comfortable process. Webb was at his core a man who valued accuracy above almost everything else. Accuracy in targeting, accuracy in assessment, accuracy in self-knowledge. And the accurate self-knowledge he was currently working through was this. He had written off a colleague in the first 4 minutes of knowing her, and in the 36 hours since then, he had been wrong about her in approximately 14 different ways and counting. He was not the kind of man who found that easy to hold. He was, however, the kind of man who would hold it rather than set it down and walk away from it. That was the difference between Webb and a lot of other people. Across the mess hall, Reyes was having a different but related experience. She had spent the day watching Emily not compete with her. Every moment where Emily could have asserted primacy, the terrain data, the corridor, report the fourth objective. She had delivered the analysis and then stepped back. She had not held credit. She had not positioned herself. She had simply put the right information in the right place and trusted that the work would speak without her narrating it. Reyes had been in the military for 9 years. She had never met anyone who did that. She found it, if she was honest, slightly unnerving. She also found it, and this was harder to admit, admirable. She ate her dinner and turned the day over in her mind and came to a conclusion that surprised her. She did not want to compete with Emily Carter. Not because she couldn't. She was genuinely good, she knew that. But because competing with Emily Carter would require her to become a smaller version of herself. It would require her to spend energy on positioning that she could spend on actual work. She did not share this conclusion with anyone, but it changed the quality of her attention for the rest of the evaluation cycle. At 2,200, Emily walked the perimeter of the barracks complex. She did this when she needed to think in motion, when the thinking was big enough that sitting still made it feel too compressed. She was thinking about Reed. Not about what he thought of her, about what he was going to do, because something had changed on the command platform today. She hadn't been able to see his face, but she had felt the quality of the observation shift, the difference between being watched by someone who is monitoring a process and being watched by someone who is trying to understand something. Those were different kinds of attention, and they produced different kinds of visibility. And she had felt the transition happen at some point during the second phase of the exercise. She thought he found something he didn't expect. She thought, that's either very good or very complicated, and I don't yet know which. She thought about the sealed file. She knew Hayes had requested it. She knew Reed had been told. She didn't know what Reed had done with that information, but she could make some assessments, and her assessments were telling her that Reed was not a man who delegated understanding to a piece of paper. He would want to hear it directly. That meant a conversation was coming. The question was whether it came before or after the final evaluation, and whether it would change what she was there to do. She stopped walking. She stood in the dark and thought about the decision she had made before she arrived at Fort Ravenwood, the reason she had accepted this transfer, the thing that no one here knew about. Yet, the thing that the sealed file referenced in language, careful enough to obscure what it actually meant. She thought about what it would cost if it came out at the wrong moment. She thought about what it would cost if it never came out at all. She made a decision. Tomorrow, in the final evaluation, she would not hold anything back. Not because she wanted to impress anyone, not because she wanted to win, but because the thing she was there to solve was real, and it was urgent, and every hour she spent being careful was an hour the problem went unsolved. She had been patient enough. It was time to let the full weight of what she knew land on the people who needed to feel it. She walked back to the barracks. She slept 4 hours, which was all she needed. And in the morning, everything changed. She slept 4 hours and woke up knowing something had shifted in the building while she was unconscious. Not a feeling, a sound. Specifically, the absence of one. At Fort Ravenwood, there was always a baseline of noise at 0500, the particular auditory texture of 200 soldiers beginning their morning routines, overlapping sounds that you stopped consciously hearing after the first day, but that your body used to calibrate the normalcy of the environment. Emily had calibrated to it in 36 hours, which was faster than most people calibrated to anything, and what she was hearing now at 0514 was not that baseline. It was quieter. Specifically quieter. The kind of quiet that happens when people are awake and moving, but deliberately subdued, which meant something had happened, or was happening, that had changed the social temperature of the barracks without anyone yet knowing what to say about it. She was dressed in 4 minutes. She found Chen in the corridor outside the barracks bay, standing with his tablet in a posture that she had already learned meant he had information he wasn't sure what to do with. "What happened?" she asked. He looked at her, then at the tablet, then back at her. 3 teams got pulled from the evaluation cycle last night. Official reason is administrative restructuring. Nobody's saying anything else." "Which 3 teams?" he told her. She worked through the implications in approximately 5 seconds. The 3 teams that had been pulled were among the top performers in the first 2 exercises, not the absolute highest, but solidly in the upper tier. Pulling them for administrative reasons in the middle of an evaluation cycle at night without announcement was not something Fort Ravenwood did. It was not something Fort Ravenwood had ever done as far as she knew from the documentation she'd reviewed before arrival. "Has anyone talked to Reed?" she asked. "Reed's office has been closed since 04:30. His aide said he's in a meeting with the generals." Emily thought the phone call. He made the call last night, and whatever he heard changed the shape of today. "Go find Hargrove," she said. "Tell him we need 5 minutes before the morning brief. Don't tell anyone else yet." Chen moved. She stood in the corridor for a moment and let the information settle into her understanding of the situation. She was not panicking. Panic was a luxury she had never been able to afford and had trained herself years ago to treat as a cost she simply wouldn't pay. But she was recalibrating. Because if Reed had made a call last night and gotten something out of that sealed file, even a partial read, even a summary, then the dynamic of the final evaluation had changed in ways she needed to map before she walked onto that field. She found Hargrove at 0521. She told him what Chen had told her and watched his face move through the sequence confusion concern, and then the focused stillness of a man who has been through enough difficult mornings to know that clarity requires deliberately slowing down. "The teams that got pulled," he said. "That's not random. No. Someone made a decision about the composition of the final evaluation." He looked at her. "Reed. Reed plus whoever he talked to last night," she said. "I don't know what they said to each other, but the teams that were pulled are the ones most likely to drive the final evaluation toward a conventional outcome." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "You mean the teams most likely to make the final exercise look like a standard performance assessment?" "Yes." "As opposed to what?" Emily looked at him steadily. "I'm not certain yet. But I think the final exercise today is going to be different from what the program outline describes." Hargrove absorbed this. He was a man who operated best when he understood the shape of what he was walking into, and what Emily was telling him was that the shape had changed overnight without anyone officially informing them of the change. Most soldiers would have found this deeply uncomfortable. Hargrove found it after a moment clarifying. Because if the exercise was different from what was advertised, then all the preparation that depended on the advertised format was only partially useful, and the most valuable thing on his team right now was someone who could read an unknown situation faster than anyone else on the field. "So what do we do?" he asked. "We go to the brief," she said. "We listen to everything Reed says and everything he doesn't say. And we don't assume we know what today's exercise is until we hear it directly." He nodded. "And if it's something nobody's prepared for," she said, "then we're more prepared than anyone else because we know that." The morning brief assembled at 0600. Colonel Reed walked in, and the room recalibrated to his presence the way rooms always did. A subtle shift in posture, a collective pulling together of attention. He looked exactly the same as he had every morning. But something in the economy of his movement was different. He was holding something very still. He stood at the front of the room and looked at the assembled soldiers for 5 full seconds without speaking. "The format of today's evaluation has been modified," he said. "The team-based exercise scheduled for this morning has been replaced by an individual command assessment. You will each be evaluated separately in sequence on a live tactical decision scenario. The scenario is identical for every candidate. The content of the scenario will not be disclosed in advance. You have 30 minutes from the time you enter the assessment room to reach a command decision and defend it. That's all." He looked at no one in particular, and everyone simultaneously, which was a skill Emily had observed in very few people, and which she filed as one of the things about him she respected. Then he said, "Carter, you're first." The room went very quiet. First, in an individual assessment, meant you had no data from anyone who had gone before you. No whispered information in corridors, no pattern deduced from what other candidates described when they came out. First meant walking into a completely unknown scenario with nothing but what you'd brought in with you. It was the hardest position in the rotation. Every soldier in the room understood this. Sergeant Webb, sitting 2 rows back, felt something tighten in his chest that was not quite sympathy and not quite guilt, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Reyes didn't react visibly, but her hands flat on her thighs pressed fractionally harder against the fabric of her uniform. Hargrove looked at the back of Emily's head and willed with the wordless force of a man who had made a deal and intended to honor it for her to be ready. Emily stood up. She looked at Reed. He looked back at her with an expression that was entirely unreadable, which was itself a kind of information. "Yes, sir," she said. She walked out of the brief room. The assessment room was not what she had expected, and Emily Carter had learned to distrust her expectations enough that she paid attention when something genuinely surprised her. She had expected a simulation room. Data screens, a tactical display, perhaps a physical model of some kind of operational environment. The standard infrastructure for a command assessment. What she walked into was a room with 2 chairs, a table, and 3 people. General Thomas Walker, General Olivia Hayes, General Richard Mason. No Colonel Reed, no simulation equipment, no data screens. Just 3 generals sitting across a table with no paperwork in front of them, and nothing between them and her except 12 feet of silence. She stopped. She took this in. She did not let what she was feeling reach her face. Hayes said, "Sit down, Lieutenant." Emily sat down. Walker leaned forward and put his forearms on the table. "I'm going to tell you something before we begin, and I want you to hear it clearly. This is not a standard assessment. The assessment Colonel Reed described this morning is a cover protocol. The other candidates will run a standard exercise. You are here for a different reason." He looked at her directly. "Are you understanding me?" "Yes, sir," Emily said. "Your file was partially decrypted last night," Walker continued. "I want to be accurate about what I mean by partially. The operational details are still sealed at a level none of us have direct access to. What we were given is a summary document, 1 page authorized by the office that manages your clearance tier, that describes in general terms the nature of your work at Thornfield and the reason for your transfer to Ravenwood." He paused. "Do you know what the summary document says?" Emily said, "I know what I did. I don't know how it was summarized." Hayes said, "Then let me tell you what we read." She folded her hands on the table. "It says that during your time at Thornfield's Classified Analytical Unit, you identified a systemic vulnerability in the decision-making architecture of 3 active operational programs. It says that this vulnerability left unaddressed creates a specific category of risk that your unit classified as Tier 1, meaning imminent and structural, not theoretical. It says that your transfer to Ravenwood was authorized not as a development placement, but as an assessment mechanism." She looked at Emily with the focused attention of a surgeon preparing an incision. "It says that you were sent here to determine whether Fort Ravenwood's training methodology has the vulnerability you identified, and to report your findings directly to a designated oversight body." The room was very quiet. Emily sat with that. Mason, who had said nothing since she walked in, said, "The question we need answered, Lieutenant, is simple. Does it—" Emily looked at him. In the 2.5 days she had spent at Fort Ravenwood, she had thought about this moment in various configurations. She had imagined it happening later in the cycle, after the full evaluation was complete. She had imagined it being mediated by Reed, who would contextualize her findings through his own relationship with the program. She had not imagined 3 generals in an empty room with no Reed and no simulation asking her directly on day 3 before the final exercise had even run. She had a choice. She could give them the measured answer, the careful, qualified, partially complete assessment that acknowledged what she had found while preserving room for additional data. That was the professionally safe version. That was the version that gave everyone, including herself, an exit if her conclusions turned out to be wrong. Or she could give them the true answer. She thought about what she'd told Chen the day before. "You'll never have certainty in this environment. The goal isn't to eliminate doubt. The goal is to make good decisions in spite of it." She said, "Yes, it does." Walker didn't react. Hayes didn't react. Mason looked at her as if she had confirmed something he'd been holding since yesterday morning. She continued, "The vulnerability isn't in the training content. The exercises are rigorous. The methodology for evaluating tactical competence is sound. The vulnerability is structural, and it's in what the program measures as leadership." She took a breath and let the next sentence land clean. "Ravenwood is producing excellent soldiers. It is systematically filtering out the candidates who are capable of questioning the framework that the excellent soldiers are being trained to operate inside." Silence. Hayes said, "Explain that." "The assessment architecture rewards performance within the given scenario parameters. A candidate who executes the stated objective faster with fewer resources, with better team management scores, higher. A candidate who identifies that the stated objective is wrong, or that the scenario parameters contain a flawed assumption, does not have a formal pathway to score that observation." The fourth objective that was embedded in yesterday's exercise, the one inserted outside the scenario framework, had no formal score component. If my team had simply ignored it and run the exercise as presented, our outcome score would have been identical. We didn't score better for catching it. We simply avoided a trap that most other teams walked into. Mason said very quietly, "But Colonel Reed knew about the embedded objective." "Yes. And the fact that he embedded it himself outside the formal scoring architecture tells me that Colonel Reed understands this problem on some level. He's been running informal tests within official tests because the official tests don't capture what he's actually trying to find." She looked at Mason directly. "He's been compensating for the vulnerability rather than addressing it, which means he knows it's there, but doesn't yet have the structural authority or framework to fix it," Walker said. "That's a significant claim about a program Colonel Reed has built over more than a decade." "Yes, sir, it is." "And you're confident in it after 72 hours on this base." "I'm confident in the specific observation I just described," Emily said. "I'm not claiming comprehensive knowledge of a program I've been inside for 3 days. I'm describing what I saw clearly enough to describe with confidence and flagging the boundaries of my certainty accurately." She looked at Walker. "The summary document you read described my role here as an assessment mechanism. This is the assessment." A long pause. Hayes uncrossed her hands and laid them flat on the table, which Emily had already learned was Hayes's physical tell for a shift in the direction of her thinking. "The question of what to do with this information is not a small one," Hayes said. "Colonel Reed has 31 years invested in this program. Telling him that the architecture has a structural flaw based on an assessment conducted over 3 days by a lieutenant who arrived with a sealed file and no official evaluation mandate is going to require a very specific kind of conversation." "I know," Emily said. "Are you prepared for that conversation?" Emily said, "General Hayes, I've been prepared for that conversation since I read the Ravenwood program documentation 3 weeks before I arrived here. What I didn't know was whether the conversation would be necessary." She met Hayes's eyes. "It's necessary." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Mason said, "There's a second element to the summary document that we haven't addressed." Emily waited. "It references a specific incident," Mason said. "An operation that preceded your transfer to Thornfield. 12 personnel, a scenario where the official tactical assessment recommended a course of action, and you recommended a contradictory course against the recommendation of 3 senior officers without formal authority to do so." He looked at her steadily. "The summary says you were right. It says the official recommendation, if followed, would have resulted in the loss of the unit." He paused. "It also says you were reprimanded for the manner in which you overrode the recommendation." Emily was very still. "I wasn't in a position to override anything formally," she said. "I presented my analysis to the officer in command. He chose to act on it." "But you presented it at a moment when there was no time for him to consult anyone else," Mason said. "And your analysis directly contradicted the plan that 3 of his senior advisors had spent 48 hours building." "Yes." You made that call knowing it would cost you. She looked at him. I made that call, she said carefully, knowing that the alternative was 12 people not coming home. The silence that followed was the longest since she'd walked into the room. It was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when people are collectively absorbing something true. Walker said, "The reprimand is still on your record." I know. That's part of why your file is sealed the way it is. The reprimand creates a complication in how your record is officially categorized. I know that too. Hayes looked at her. Does it bother you? Emily considered the question genuinely. What bothers me is that 12 people are alive and that fact is classified. What bothers me is that the decision to seal my record means that the lesson from that operation, the specific analytical failure that put those 12 people in that position in the first place, is also sealed. Nobody learns from it because nobody officially knows it happened. She met Hayes's eyes. That's the same vulnerability I just described in Ravenwood's architecture. The system protects its own record over its own improvement, and the cost of that protection is paid by people who have nothing to do with the decision to protect it. Hayes looked at Walker. Walker looked at Mason. Mason looked at Emily. He said, "That's what the summary document couldn't quite capture." The door opened. Colonel Marcus Reed walked in. He looked at the three generals. He looked at Emily. He pulled the fourth chair from against the wall and sat down at the head of the table without being invited and without asking permission, which was, Emily thought, exactly the right thing to do, and which told her something important about who he was when he wasn't performing authority for an audience. He said, "How much has she told you?" Hayes said, "Enough." Reed nodded. He looked at Emily directly for the first time since the brief room that morning. "You knew," he said, "before you got here. You knew what you were walking into." "I knew the framework," Emily said. "I didn't know the people." "Does that matter? The people?" "It matters more than the framework," she said. "The framework can be changed. Whether the people are willing to change it, that's the actual question." Reed looked at her for a long moment. He was doing the thing she had observed in him from the first day, the internal calculation fast and thorough, the processing of information against a model of the world that was more complete than most people's. He was not a man who required things to be explained twice or simplified for his comfort. He was a man who needed sometimes to be given new information in a direct and unvarnished way, and who would then process it fully and respond to what was actually true rather than what was comfortable. He said, "You're right about the scoring architecture." Nobody spoke. He said it again differently. "I've known for 2 years that the formal scoring doesn't capture the thing I'm actually trying to find. I built the embedded test last year because I needed a data point that the official system couldn't generate. I didn't have a plan for what to do with the data once I had it." He looked at the three generals. "Because addressing it formally means acknowledging formally that the program has been producing a specific category of incomplete graduate for longer than I want to say out loud in this room." Walker said, "How long?" Reed was quiet for 4 seconds. 7 years, he said, "since the assessment overhaul and the last program restructuring. The restructuring was designed to increase output volume. It did. It also narrowed the evaluation criteria in ways that weren't fully modeled before implementation." Hayes said, "You've been aware of this for 2 years. I've been certain of it for 2 years. I had suspicions for 3 before that. And you didn't bring it forward." Reed looked at Hayes with an expression that was not defensive and not apologetic, but that carried the weight of someone who has spent years carrying a thing they know they should have set down differently. "I didn't bring it forward because I didn't know how to recommend fixing a problem without simultaneously documenting the scale of what the problem had already produced. Every class that has graduated from Ravenwood in the past 7 years went through an assessment that was missing this component. That's not a small number of officers." He paused. "I thought I could address it quietly. Rebuild the architecture from inside. Embed tests until I had enough data to propose a formal change." Mason said, "And instead, we sent you a lieutenant with a sealed file." Reed looked at Emily. She said nothing. He said, "Instead, you sent me someone who caught the embedded test in 41 minutes and then reverse engineered my entire methodology by day 2. A beat. I made a phone call last night because I needed to know if she was what she appeared to be." "And?" Walker asked. Reed said, "She's considerably more." For a moment, the room held that. Then Hayes said, "So what do we do now?" And this was the question, the real one, the one that had been underneath every other question in this room since Emily walked in. Not what had happened, not what was wrong, not who knew what and when. But what do we do now? Emily said, "You let me finish the evaluation." Everyone looked at her. The other candidates, they deserve a complete cycle. They came here to be assessed, and the assessment owes them something real. She looked at Reed. "I'd like to finish the full 72 hours. Run the final exercise alongside the rest of the candidates." Reed studied her. "Why?" "Because the recommendation I'm going to give the oversight body carries more weight if it comes from someone who completed the full program, rather than someone who was pulled out of it early for a private conversation." She met his eyes. "And because I want to see how the final exercise runs. The last data point matters." Walker said, "And after the evaluation, I write the assessment report. I include everything: the scoring architecture flaw, the embedded test data, the 7-year timeline, the specific recommendations for structural change." She looked around the table. "And I recommend that Colonel Reed lead the redesign. Because the fact that he's been compensating for this problem for 2 years by running informal embedded tests means he understands it better than anyone. You don't want someone new building the fix. You want the person who's been living with the problem long enough to know exactly where the edges are." Reed looked at her. She looked back. Something passed between them that wasn't a word and wasn't a gesture, but that both of them understood as completely as if it had been written down. This is the beginning of something, and we're both going to have to decide how much of ourselves to put into it. He said, "You go back to the evaluation, same as the other candidates." "Thank you, sir." She stood up. She was almost at the door when Mason said, "Lieutenant Carter." She turned. He said, "The 12 personnel from before Thornfield." She waited. He said, "I know who they were." She looked at him. He looked back at her with that particular quality of attention she had noted on the first day, the kind that felt physical, like something being pressed carefully against you to test its fit. He said, "One of them is currently in command of a forward operating unit in a theater I won't name in this room. He requested through channels I also won't name that your file be reviewed." A pause. "He requested it 3 years ago. It has taken this long for the review to produce what you are currently standing in." Emily was completely still. "He didn't tell me," she said. "No," Mason said. "He thought you'd resist the process if you knew it was coming." She thought about that. She thought about 12 people. She thought about the night she had made a decision that cost her something she had not yet fully calculated, and that had apparently been working its way toward this room for 3 years without her knowledge. She said, "He was probably right." Mason nodded once. "He usually is. That's why he's commanding a forward unit." He paused. "Go finish your evaluation, Lieutenant." She walked back out into the corridor. She stood there for a moment in the particular quality of stillness that comes after something irrevocable has happened and your mind is catching up to the fact of it. Then she walked back to the assembly area because Hargrove and Chen and Reyes and Webb and Voss and Ortega were waiting for the next phase to begin, and whatever had just happened in that room, whatever was going to come next, the evaluation was still real, and the team was still hers, and there was still work to do. She turned the corner and found them where she'd left them, 6 people in various postures of waiting, and Hargrove looked up when he saw her face. "Well," he said. She looked at him. She looked at all of them. She thought about what she could tell them and what she couldn't, and what she owed them given everything that had happened since Tuesday morning. She said, "Final exercise in 30 minutes. I need 5 minutes with each of you individually before we go in." Reyes frowned. "Why individually?" Emily said, "Because what I need to tell each of you is different." It was the most honest answer she had given anyone about her methodology, and the effect it had on the team was not what she expected. Webb, who had been watching her with that recalibrated attention since yesterday evening, said, "You've been doing that the whole time, haven't you? Talking to each of us differently." She looked at him. He wasn't angry. He was, she realized, almost admiring. "Is that what happened? You read each of us and figured out how to talk to us in a way we'd actually hear?" She said very simply, "Yes." Voss said, "That's either really smart or really unsettling." "It can be both," Emily said. For a half second nobody spoke. Then Chen, who had been quiet since the mess hall, said, "Lieutenant, did the meeting go the way you needed it to?" She looked at him. He was 23 years old, and sharp and open, and asking the right question with the particular directness of someone who had decided that if you'd earned his trust, you deserved a real question. She said, "It went the way it needed to go." He nodded. "Good enough." It was not good enough. It was more than that and less than that simultaneously, and she carried the weight of that complexity back through the corridor toward the final phase of the evaluation, with the full knowledge that the thing she had started in that room with 3 generals and 1 colonel was not finished, would not be finished for a long time, and that the cost and the purpose of it were at this particular moment exactly equal. The final exercise was 30 minutes away. She had exactly what she needed. She walked toward it. The 5 individual conversations took 4 minutes and 40 seconds total. With Hargrove, she said, "The final exercise is going to ask you to make a decision you don't have enough information to make comfortably. When that happens, trust your instinct on the people, not the data. You read people better than you know." He looked at her. "That's it. That's the thing you need to hear. Everything else you already know." He nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when he's been given something real and is deciding where to put it. With Chen, she said, "Stop second-guessing the first answer. You've been right every time you trusted it and wrong every time you talked yourself out of it. I've been watching." Chen opened his mouth and closed it. Then, every time, she said, "Go." With Reyes, she said nothing initially. She just looked at her for a moment, and Reyes looked back with that competitive intelligence burning steadily behind her eyes, and then Emily said, "You've been running at 60% because you've been spending 40% watching me. Stop watching me. Run at 100. Reyes was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "You noticed." "I notice everything. That's my problem and yours." A pause. "You're the best tactical mind on this team when you're not managing your feelings about whether that's true. Go be the best tactical mind on this team." Reyes turned away without another word, but her shoulders had changed. Something in the set of them was different, looser, and at the same time, more purposeful. The posture of someone who has just been relieved of a weight they'd been carrying so long, they'd forgotten it was optional. With Voss, she said, "When Hargrove hesitates, and he will hesitate once about 40 minutes and back him before anyone else does, he needs to hear it from you specifically." Voss frowned slightly. "Why me specifically?" "Because you're the one whose opinion he trusts most and thinks about least, which means it lands clean. No politics, no competition. Just, I back this call." Emily held her eyes. "That 40 seconds of support will matter more than anything else you do today." Voss absorbed this. "How do you know he'll hesitate at 40 minutes? Because that's when the scenario will look most like the decision he got wrong the last time he ran something like this, and the brain defaults to the memory of pain when the pattern matches. He'll need a second to get past it." Voss was quiet. Then, "You figured all of that out?" "Help him," Emily said. "That's all." With Ortega, she said, "There's going to be a logistics gap in the final phase, probably around the 60-minute mark. Everyone else is going to focus on the tactical problem. You're going to see the supply chain issue underneath it before anyone else does. Name it out loud. Don't wait for permission." Ortega looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise, with something more complicated, the look of someone who has been doing good work in a room where no one is facing the right direction to see it, and who has just been told that the work has been seen. He said, "How long have you known?" "Since the first exercise," she said. "You see what other people miss. You've just been waiting for someone to ask you to say it." She met his eyes. "I'm asking. Today, say it without waiting." His jaw tightened, not against emotion in preparation, like a man setting his feet before a run. With Webb, she said nothing at first. She stood in front of him, and he stood in front of her, and the compressed history of the past 72 hours was between them like something physical. He said, "What do you need me to do?" She said, "I need you to be exactly what you are. No more complicated than that." He looked at her. "You're good at your job," she said. "You're precise, you're reliable, and when you make a mistake, you face it directly instead of explaining it away. That's rarer than you think." She paused. "Today I need all of that, not a version of it. All of it." Webb said, "And what was this week?" She understood what he was asking, not the evaluation. What happened between us? How do I hold what I did at the beginning alongside what I know now? She said, "This week was a group of people learning something true about themselves, including you." A pause. "Including me." He looked at her steadily. "What did you learn?" She said that the gap between how people first appear and what they actually are is always worth crossing. It was, she realized as she said it, the truest thing she'd said out loud in 3 days. Webb received it with the particular stillness of a man who has been handed something he knows is valuable and wants to make sure he doesn't drop it. He said, "Okay." She said, "Okay." They went in. The final exercise room was configured differently from anything they'd used in the previous 2 days, and Emily clocked the differences in the first 8 seconds. The physical arrangement of the decision stations had been modified. The standard command display had been replaced with a multi-input feed she hadn't seen in any Ravenwood documentation, and there were 3 additional observers she didn't recognize standing at the far wall alongside Reed, Hayes Walker, and Mason. She noted the unknown observers and filed them. Later, the exercise coordinator, a major she recognized from the pressure rotation as being exceptionally good at explaining complex scenarios in the minimum number of words, stood at the front of the room and said, "This is a Category 7 command scenario. Most of you have not encountered Category 7 in any previous training context. Here is what that means." He described it. Emily listened and translated simultaneously into implications. A Category 7 was a scenario with cascading failure conditions, multiple systems degrading simultaneously in a sequence that was not random, but that was not immediately legible as a pattern. The failure cascade was designed to mimic the conditions of an actual operational breakdown rather than a constructed training exercise. The key difference was this. In a standard exercise, there was an answer. In a Category 7, there were decisions. The difference between those two things was the difference between a test with a score and a situation with consequences. Hargrove leaned slightly toward Emily. Without looking at her, he said very quietly, "You've seen this before." She said equally quiet, "Something like it." "Is that good?" "For us," she said. "Yes." The exercise began at 08:45. The first 3 minutes were deceptively manageable. A communications failure in a forward unit. A resource request from a secondary team that conflicted with the primary objective's supply requirements. A personnel issue 2 officers in a subordinate command whose conflict of judgment was creating a coordination breakdown. Standard cascade opening. Emily recognized the structure. The first phase was designed to occupy cognitive bandwidth with legitimate problems so that the second phase could introduce the real problem into an already crowded decision space. "Reyes," Emily said. "The personnel conflict, what's your read?" Reyes had been running at full capacity since the corridor. "It's a distraction. The conflict is real, but both officers are functional. They're going to perform despite the conflict if we leave them alone. If we intervene, we spend resources and time, And we signal to the rest of the unit that leadership is monitoring internal dynamics, which creates a different problem. Correct, Emily said. Leave it. Hargrove, the supply conflict, you have 60 seconds. Hargrove was already working it. He ran the resource allocation and came to a decision in 45 seconds. Split the supplies 70-30 in favor of the primary objective. The secondary team can adapt. Good. Chen. Communications failure is partial, not complete, Chen said, not waiting to be asked. He'd been watching the data feed and had seen it 2 seconds before she turned to him. There's a secondary channel they haven't switched to because they're not aware it's available. If we push that information down to them, the failure resolves in 4 minutes without any resource expenditure. Emily looked at him. He was running at full capacity too. Every conversation this morning was paying out. Do it, she said. Ortega, what's the logistics picture? Ortega said, supply chain to the primary objective is going to hit a constraint in approximately 22 minutes. There's a route optimization that nobody's flagged yet that buys us an extra 11 minutes before the constraint becomes critical. Do you want me to run it? Start running it, Emily said. Webb, I need you on the incoming communications feed. Flag anything that doesn't match the voice pattern of the senders we've already established. If someone new is talking to us, I want to know before I read the content of what they're saying. On it, Webb said. 8 minutes in the team was managing the first phase cascade with more bandwidth to spare than any other team in the room. Emily could feel the quality of their coordination, not the effortful quality of people trying to work together, but the easier, faster quality of people who have been working together long enough that the handoffs happen without the joins showing. Above them on the observer platform, one of the 3 people Emily didn't recognize said to Walker, "The communication management alone is exceptional. Who designed that relay structure?" Walker said nobody did. They built it in the first hour of the first exercise. The observer said nothing. He wrote something down. At minute 12, the second phase hit. It arrived as a single piece of incoming data, a report from a command element above Team 9's position in the scenario hierarchy, delivering new orders that directly contradicted the approach they had been executing for the past 12 minutes. Not a modification, a contradiction. The new orders told them to abandon the primary objective, redirect all resources to a holding position, and await further instruction. 3 other teams in the room received the same orders and immediately began complying. Team 9 stopped. Hargrove read the orders. His jaw tightened in a way that Emily recognized from their conversation 2 days ago as his body's response to the sensation of the floor changing beneath him without warning. He looked at Emily. She said, "Read it again." He read it again. Something shifted in his expression. The authentication code. "What about it?" Reyes said, leaning over. "It's 1 digit short," Hargrove said slowly. "Standard authentication for orders at this classification level is 12 digits. This code is 11. The room heard it. The 3 teams that had been complying stopped. Chen was already checking the authentication database. 11 digits. The format is correct for a level below this scenario's command structure. These orders couldn't have come from above us in the hierarchy. The authentication code proves they came from a lateral or subordinate element." Hargrove looked at Emily. "It's a false order. It's a test of whether you follow orders you haven't verified," she said. "The real question isn't what the orders say. The real question is whether the orders are legitimate." Webb said from the communication station, 3 teams complied before checking the authentication. "I know," Emily said. "That means they've just redirected their entire resource allocation based on an order that came from an unauthorized source." "I know," Hargrove said. "Do we alert them?" Emily paused. This was the question that mattered. This was the moment that the exercise had been building toward since the authentication code arrived. Not whether Team 9 could identify the false order they had, but what they did with the identification. She said, "We flag it to the exercise coordinator as a scenario anomaly. We do not correct the other teams directly. Correcting them directly is not our role, it's command's role. And if we bypass command to do it ourselves, we're committing a version of the same error they made when they followed unverified orders." Hargrove looked at her for one long moment. Then he flagged the anomaly to the exercise coordinator. 40 seconds later, the coordinator's voice came through the command channel. Authentication alert confirmed. All teams hold current position pending command verification. The 3 teams that had redirected their resources scrambled to return to their previous posture. Team 9 had never left theirs. Reyes said very quietly to no one in particular, "We just saved 40 minutes. Chen said, "We just saved the objective." Voss said nothing. But she looked at Emily with an expression that had nothing performative in it. Not admiration, not calculation, not the managed response of someone deciding how to register a feeling. Just genuine, unmediated recognition. This is what she is. On the observer platform, one of the 3 people Emily didn't recognize had stopped writing and put down his pen. He was a man in his mid-60s, unremarkable in appearance. Except for the particular quality of stillness, he had the stillness of someone who has spent a long time in rooms where what you don't show matters more than what you do. He had not spoken since the exercise began. He looked at Reed and said, "She held the team in position while flagging to command." Reed said yes. She understood the distinction between identifying the problem and solving the problem through the correct channel. Yes. The man was quiet for a moment. "Colonel Reed, how long have you been running the embedded 4th objective in your evaluation cycle?" Reed said. "This is the first full cycle. I ran test versions in 2 previous cycles." And she caught it in the first exercise. "In the first exercise," Reed confirmed. The man turned back to the field below. "Then she's already told you what you already know." Reed looked at him. "Sir." The man, and something in the way Reed said "sir," established clearly that this person's rank occupied a category above the 3 generals standing next to him. A fact that had apparently not been shared with the general population of the observer platform. Said, "She told you the program has a structural flaw. You already knew. She told you it's been present for 7 years. You already knew that too." He paused. "What she gave you that you didn't have before is a framework for addressing it that doesn't require the program to defend itself while simultaneously reforming itself. That's the harder problem, and she solved it in a room with 3 generals before the final exercise began." He looked at Reed with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, but carried the weight of someone who has assessed a great many things and found very few of them surprising. The question is what you're going to do with it. Reed said, "I've already decided." "I know," the man said. "So have I." Below them at the 40-minute mark, exactly when Emily had told Voss it would happen. Hargrove hesitated. It was not a dramatic hesitation. It was the internal kind, the kind that doesn't show in any obvious way, but that produces a half-beat of stillness in someone's decision-making that the people closest to them can read like a barometric drop before rain. Emily felt it. Voss felt it. The scenario had just delivered a complication that looked structurally in the arrangement of its variables almost exactly like the situation Hargrove had described from his previous evaluation. The one where he'd frozen for 40 seconds and lost the secondary objective. Same shape, different content. His body remembered the shape. Voss said, "Hargrove, I back your call." He looked at her. She said, "Whatever you're about to decide, I'm with it." He was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he made the call. It was the right call. Not because it was the obvious call, it wasn't. It was the right call because it prioritized the sustained capacity of the team over the immediate gain of the objective, which was the kind of decision that looked wrong in the short term and right in the longer one, and which required the specific kind of confidence that only comes from a commander who trusts that his team will execute even when the logic isn't immediately legible to everyone. Emily made no comment. She simply pivoted to the next problem. But in her peripheral vision, she saw Voss give the smallest nod to herself, the private acknowledgement of someone who has done exactly what they intended and found that it worked. At the 55-minute mark, Ortega said, "Supply chain constraint. Earlier than I projected. There's a secondary route, but it adds 8 minutes to the logistics tail. 3 things happen simultaneously. the team's communications feed lit up with 3 new incoming reports. The primary objective's status updated to show a condition change that required reassessment. And Hargrove turned to Emily for the first time in 20 minutes and said, "I need your read. Now." She had been watching all 3 things develop in parallel. She said, "Ortega's route. Take it. The 8 minutes is recoverable. A supply chain failure is not. Chen, those 3 reports you're going to find that 2 of them are echoes of the same event reported from different positions. The 3rd is new. Find the 3rd. Reyes." "Already on the objective reassessment," Reyes said, not looking up. "Good. Webb, I need a communication to the forward unit. Short. Tell them to hold current position and expect a 12-minute gap in supply before the secondary route comes online. Don't ask them to confirm receipt, just send it. They'll confirm when they have bandwidth." Webb said, "Sending." The next 7 minutes were the fastest of the exercise. The team moved through them with the efficiency of something that had been built for exactly this. Not a group of 6 people making individual decisions in proximity to each other, but a single decision-making organism with 6 points of contact, and one distributed shared understanding of what they were trying to do and why. None of them narrated this to each other. None of them had to. At the 63-minute mark, Chen said, "The 3rd report is new. It's a..." He stopped. Emily looked at him. "Say it." "It's a personnel casualty report from the secondary team. 1 officer down non-critical, but it changes their command structure. Their senior officer is now the junior officer from the conflict we flagged in Phase 1. Hargrove said immediately, "The conflict we didn't intervene in," Emily said. "Which means the junior officer is now in command of a unit that has reason to distrust his judgment because of a conflict we chose not to address." Silence. Brief, dense. Reyes said, "We made the wrong call." "We made the right call with the information we had," Emily said. Her voice was precise. Not defensive, precise. "The information changed. What do we do with the new information, not with regret about the old decision?" Hargrove said, "We contact the unit. Now." "Contact them," Emily said. Short, direct. Acknowledge the command change, confirm their current objectives, and ask specifically whether they have what they need to continue. Don't make the assumption. Ask. Webb sent the communication. The response came back in 90 seconds. The newly promoted junior officer, formerly the source of the command conflict, now in an unexpected position of authority, responded with a report that was clear, organized, and precise. He had apparently been ready for this for longer than anyone had asked him to be. Reyes read the response and said, "He's fine, he's better than fine." Emily said, "People usually are when you actually ask." The final phase of the exercise arrived at minute 71, and it was not what any of them had anticipated. The scenario didn't deliver a climax. It delivered a question. The exercise coordinator's voice came through the command channel and said, "All teams, final assessment prompt. You have 5 minutes to respond. The scenario is resolved. Your team has successfully navigated the cascade. 1 question remains, and your answer to this question is the final scored element of the evaluation. Ready?" Hargrove said, "Ready." Based on your experience of this exercise, not the scenario content, but the process of running it, what is the single most significant improvement that Fort Ravenwood's evaluation architecture should make to better identify effective leaders? You have 5 minutes. 1 answer per team. The room went very quiet. In the observer platform above, Reed had gone completely still. He had not put that question in the exercise. He looked at Hayes. Hayes was looking at the ceiling, which was her version of a smile. He looked at Walker. Walker was watching the floor below with an expression of focused interest. He looked at Mason, who met his eyes and said nothing. He looked at the man who had occupied the 4th position at the end of the platform, the man whose rank Reed had not introduced to anyone that morning, and that man was watching Team 9 with an expression that Reed had seen on very few faces in 31 years of military service. It was the expression of someone watching a bet pay out. On the field, Team 9 had not immediately spoken. They were looking at each other, or at the space between each other, and Emily could feel them each arriving at their answer, through the particular pathway their own mind used to reach a conclusion. Webb got there first, which surprised her. He said, "Tell me if I'm wrong." "But I think the answer is this. The program needs to score what happens when someone questions the problem, not just when they solve it." Reyes nodded slowly. The fourth objective. "Not just the fourth objective," Hargrove said. "Every embedded test. Every time this evaluation rewarded someone for noticing that the question was the problem." He paused. "Those moments don't appear anywhere in the formal score. They happened, and they mattered, and the record shows nothing." Chen said, "So the people who question the framework leave this program looking identical on paper to the people who never noticed the framework existed." Hargrove looked at Emily. She said, "Write that." He said, "That's your answer. You should be the one to write it." She said, "It's the team's answer. You should be the one to write it." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he turned to the response terminal and said, "The evaluation should formally score the capacity to identify flawed assumptions in the problem itself, not only the capacity to solve the problem as presented. A leader who solves the wrong problem efficiently is more dangerous than a leader who solves the right problem slowly. The current architecture cannot distinguish between them." He submitted it. 60 seconds later, the exercise coordinator said, "Evaluation complete. All teams stand down." The room released a long collective exhale, the particular kind of exhale that comes at the end of something that required more than was comfortable to give. Voss sat down in the nearest chair and looked at her hands. Ortega said, "Did we get it right?" Nobody answered immediately. Then Webb said, "We got it true. I don't know if that's the same as right." "It is," Emily said. She said it quietly and without elaboration, and in the tone of someone who has paid for the knowledge they're conveying and is giving it away freely, because that's what you do with something that costs you. She looked up at the observer platform. Colonel Marcus Reed was looking down at her. She thought about 31 years. She thought about 7 years of compensating for a problem in silence. She thought about a sealed file, and a 12-person unit, and a reprimand that was still on her record, and a man in a forward operating unit who had requested a review 3 years ago and not told her. She thought about the man at the far end of the observer platform, the one whose rank Reed hadn't introduced, the one who had put the final question into an exercise that wasn't his exercise, and who had been watching her since she walked in with the expression of someone watching a bet payout. She thought, "I don't know yet what this costs." She thought, "I know what it's for." Reed held her eyes for a moment longer. Then he nodded once. Not with ceremony, not with performance. The nod of one person to another who has done something real and difficult and true in the presence of witnesses who now understand exactly what they were watching. She nodded back. And then Hargrove said quietly beside her, "What happens now?" She said, "Now we find out." What happens now turned out to mean 40 minutes in a corridor outside the evaluation debrief room, waiting to be called in. The other teams filed past in groups, their faces carrying the particular texture of people who had been through something genuine and hadn't yet had time to decide how they felt about it. Some of them looked at Team 9. A few nodded. One soldier, a sergeant from Team 4, whom Emily didn't know by name but had clocked during the first exercise, as someone precise and observant, stopped briefly and said to no one in particular, but clearly to her, the authentication code. First person in our room to call it out cited your team's flag as the reason they checked. He paused. Wanted you to know that. He walked on before she could respond. Webb watched him go and said, "We didn't even know we were helping them." "That's usually how it works," Emily said. Hargrove looked at her sideways. "Is that a philosophy or an observation?" "Both," she said. The door to the debrief room opened at 10:31, and the evaluation coordinator gestured Team 9 inside. The room was configured as a standard after-action review. One long table, one side for the evaluation team, one side for the candidates. Reed sat at the center of the evaluator's side. Hayes and Walker flanked him. Mason sat at the far end, the same studied distance he maintained everywhere, close enough to be present and far enough to be independent. The man from the end of the observer platform was not in the room. Emily noted his absence and filed it. Reed opened without preamble, which she had expected. He said, "Before I run the formal after action, I'm going to say something outside the formal record." He looked at the team. This evaluation cycle produced more genuinely useful data for this program than any cycle I have run in the past 4 years. Some of that data came from where you'd expect it. Most of it didn't. He looked at each of them in sequence, and his eyes were not the eyes of a man delivering a prepared statement. They were the eyes of a man who has spent 72 hours recalibrating and is now operating from the new calibration. The question you submitted as your final response, the answer about scoring the capacity to question the problem rather than only solve it, has been forwarded verbatim to program oversight. That is not standard procedure. I want you to know that it was deliberate. Nobody spoke. Reyes was the first to find her voice. "Who made that decision, sir?" Reed said. "I did." He paused exactly 1 beat. "With encouragement." Walker almost smiled. Hayes looked at the table. Mason looked at nothing. Reed said, "On to the formal record." The after-action review took 40 minutes. It was thorough, specific, and honest in the way that good after-action reviews are honest. It didn't celebrate performance. It examined it. Reed walked through every decision point, identified what had worked, and the specific mechanism by which it had worked, and identified what hadn't worked, and the specific mechanism by which it had failed. When Team 9 had left the secondary unit's command conflict unaddressed in Phase 1, he named this as a decision that was correct, given available information, and incorrect, given subsequent information, and he said precisely, "The lesson is not that you made the wrong call. The lesson is that correct given current information is a temporary category, not a permanent one. Your obligation doesn't end when you make the decision. It continues as long as the situation continues." Hargrove nodded. Chen wrote something down. Webb said, "Sir, the teams that followed the false orders." Reed looked at him. "What about them?" "They're going to know they were the teams that followed the false orders. That's—" He stopped choosing words. "That's going to sit with them for a while." Reed said, "Yes, it will." He didn't soften it. "That's appropriate. Mistakes in training exist so they don't exist in the field. The discomfort is part of the function." Webb accepted this. But something in the way he'd asked told Emily he hadn't been asking for himself. He'd been asking for them, the other teams. That was new. Webb from 72 hours ago had not thought in that direction, and she noted the change the way you note any data point that tells you something real. The formal after-action ended at 11:13. Reed said, "Dismissed. Evaluation results will be posted within 6 hours." He paused. "Carter, stay." The team looked at Emily. She looked back at them with an expression that communicated clearly and without elaboration, "Go. I'll be fine." Hargrove held her eyes for 1 moment longer than the others, and in that moment passed the compressed weight of 3 days' worth of accumulated trust, not approval, not loyalty in the performed sense, but the real thing, which is quieter and harder to name and doesn't require a gesture to transmit. He walked out. The door closed. The room held Emily, Reed, and the 3 generals. Reed said, "He's here." Emily said, "I know. He arrived this morning. He was on the observer platform during the final exercise." "I saw him. I didn't recognize him." "You weren't supposed to." Reed looked at her steadily. "He requested this posting 8 months ago. The administrative process for a review at his level takes time. You arrived here before the review was complete, which is why the cover protocol was necessary." He paused. "His name is General Harlan Voss. No relation to your Sergeant Voss. He is the current director of the Strategic Assessment Division, which is the oversight body that your Thornfield unit reported to." Emily was quiet for a moment. She thought 3 years ago a man in a forward operating unit filed a review request. 8 months ago, the director of the oversight body that received that request decided to come personally. The review process produced her transfer to Ravenwood, which produced the last 72 hours, which produced a team's final response that was forwarded verbatim to program oversight. She thought this was a much longer game than I understood. She said, "What does he want?" Reed said, "He wants to talk to you. He's waiting in my office." Hayes stood up. "We'll give you the room." She looked at Emily with an expression that Emily had been trying to read correctly since Tuesday morning, and that she now understood was not evaluation and not professional neutrality, but something closer to recognition. The particular expression of a woman who has spent a career being underestimated and who has learned to identify the same experience in others by the specific quality of how they carry it. "For what it's worth, Lieutenant, the assessment you gave us this morning was the clearest analysis of a structural problem that I have heard in a room like this in a very long time. You said it without hedging and without performing certainty you didn't have, which is a combination that most people cannot manage. That matters." She walked out. Walker followed. Mason paused at the door. He said, "The 12 personnel." Emily looked at him. "When you see Voss," Mason said, "ask him about the operational outcome report from that mission, the full version, not the summary." He held her eyes. "You were told there was a reprimand on your record. You were not told everything that is on your record." He walked out. The door closed again. Reed sat across from her in a room that was suddenly very quiet. He said, "Are you ready for this?" She said, "I've been ready for 3 years." He nodded. He stood. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that had not been available to him on Tuesday morning, that had not been built yet, that had required 72 hours and a series of encounters he had not anticipated to construct itself. It was not admiration exactly, and it was not respect in the formal sense. It was the look of a man who has spent his career alone in a particular understanding of something, and who has just discovered he is not, after all, alone. He said, "My office is at the end of the East Corridor. He's been there since 0900. She said, "Thank you, sir." He said, "Don't thank me yet." She was not sure whether that was a warning or honesty or both, and she carried the uncertainty with her down the East Corridor. General Harlan Voss was 67 years old and did not look it. Not because he had been preserved by good fortune, but because he had been worn in the specific way that certain materials are worn by sustained use, not degraded, but refined. He was sitting in Reed's chair when she walked in, which was either a deliberate signal or simply the behavior of a man who sat wherever was most practical and had stopped thinking about what it communicated. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "Sit down, Emily." She sat down. He had used her first name. She noted this. In her experience, people in rooms like this used first names in one of two conditions: when they wanted you to feel that rank didn't apply, or when they wanted to signal an existing relationship that the rank structure didn't capture. She didn't yet know which this was. He said, "I read the after-action summary from your 3rd year at Thornfield, the internal one, not the version that exists in your official record." She said, "How many versions are there?" 3, he said. "The official record, which contains the reprimand and a sanitized account of the mission that removes the analytical failure preceding it. The internal Thornfield version, which documents the full sequence of events, including the decision you made and its outcome. And a 3rd document that was produced by the director of Thornfield 6 months after the mission." She waited. "The 3rd document," Voss said, "is a formal recommendation for your record to be expunged of the reprimand and replaced with a commendation for the decision you made. That document has been sitting in an administrative review queue for 2 years and 4 months. He looked at her directly. "I released it this morning." Emily was very still. "The reprimand," she said carefully, "is no longer on your record as of 0830 today." He paused. "You have a commendation in its place. The wording describes the specific decision you made and the specific outcome it produced in full unclassified. It is now part of your accessible record." She sat with this. She had carried that reprimand for 3 years. Not as a wound exactly, she was not built for wounds in the ordinary sense, but as a weight. The particular weight of having done something right in a way that the system recorded as wrong, and of knowing that the recording would follow her in every room she entered, shaping how she was read before she opened her mouth. She said, "Why today?" Voss said, "Because this morning you walked into a room with 3 generals and gave them an institutional critique of a program run by a colonel with 31 years of decorated service, and you gave it clearly and accurately, and without softening it for the comfort of the room. And you recommended that the man you were critiquing be the one to lead the reform." He looked at her. "I have been in this work for 40 years. I have been in a great many rooms. What you did this morning is not something most people can do at any rank." He paused. "You did it as a lieutenant with a sealed file and a reprimand on your record in front of people who had every institutional reason to hear it as insubordination rather than analysis." She said, "They didn't hear it as insubordination." "No," he said, "they didn't, because you didn't deliver it as insubordination. You delivered it as fact. There's a difference, and most people can't hold that distinction under pressure." He folded his hands on the table. "I want to talk to you about what comes next." She looked at him. He said, "The assessment report you're going to write about Ravenwood, I want it broadened." "Broadened how?" "The structural flaw you identified in this program's evaluation architecture is not unique to this program." He said it plainly. "I have been aware for longer than I am comfortable saying out loud that the problem you diagnosed at Ravenwood exists in variants across multiple programs in the assessment pipeline. Different mechanisms, same fundamental flaw. The systems are scoring execution rather than judgment compliance, rather than discernment, and they are systematically producing a specific category of leader who is highly capable inside a functioning system and catastrophically unprepared for a system that has stopped functioning." She said, "The Category 7 scenario." "Yes. We built Category 7 12 years ago precisely because we understood this was coming. The problem is that Category 7 exists in one program as a single exercise at the end of a 72-hour cycle, and the insights it produces are not being systematically integrated into the broader assessment architecture." He paused. "I want your assessment report to address the full scope of the problem, not just the Ravenwood instance." She said, "I've been here for 3 days. I know. The broader architecture requires data I don't have. I know that too." He looked at her steadily. "That is why the report will not be due in 3 days. It will be due in 6 months. And in those 6 months, you will have access to the full assessment pipeline, every program, every evaluation architecture, every internal review that has been produced in the past decade." He paused. "I'm giving you the scope and the access. You produce the analysis." The room was very quiet. She understood what he was offering. Not a report, a mandate. The kind of mandate that came with institutional authority behind it, and with the particular responsibility of knowing that what you produced would either change something real or be filed somewhere and forgotten, and that the difference between those two outcomes depended entirely on how accurately and how completely you were willing to see what was actually there. She said, "Colonel Reed. What about him? He needs to be involved, not consulted involved. He's been living with this problem from inside the system for 7 years. He has data I will never generate from outside it." She met Voss's eyes. "If you want an assessment that can actually be implemented rather than just understood, you need someone who knows where the resistance will come from and why. Reed knows that." Voss said, "Reed has already been notified of an expanded advisory role pending this conversation." She absorbed this. "You assumed I would recommend him." "I did not assume," Voss said. "I assessed. There's a difference." And there it was. Her own language returned to her from the mouth of a 67-year-old man who had apparently been paying attention for considerably longer than she'd known he existed. She felt something shift in her chest that was not quite a smile and not quite relief, but lived in the territory between them. She said, "When does this start?" He said, "It started 3 years ago when you made a decision in the field that 12 people came home because of." He stood up. "Formally, it starts when you walk out of this building. The orders are already cut." She stood up. He said, One more thing. She waited. The man who filed the original review request, Voss said. 3 years ago from the forward operating unit. She said, Mason told me. Mason told you that a man filed a review request. He didn't tell you the rest. Voss looked at her with an expression that was for the first time in this conversation something warmer than professional. He filed the request because he had spent 6 months watching his unit operate under the command of a leader who had been shaped, trained, evaluated, credentialed by a system that did not produce people like you. He said in the request that the gap between what the system was building and what the field actually required had become impossible to ignore. He paused. He said he was writing the request because someone needed to fix the pipeline, and the only person he had ever seen who understood both the problem and the solution well enough to do something real about it was a lieutenant whose record had been incorrectly filed. She was quiet. He's going to be at Fort Ravenwood in 3 weeks, Voss said. His rotation brings him stateside. He requested a stop here specifically. A pause. I thought you should know that before you saw him. She said, What's his name? Voss told her. She stood in the quiet of Reed's office with the name settling into her understanding of the past 3 years, and the shape of everything she had believed was behind her rearranged itself into something she hadn't seen from the angle she'd been standing. She said, He could have told me. He could have. Voss agreed. He chose not to. Why? He said, and I am quoting directly, because she would have told me it wasn't necessary, and spent 3 years believing that, and I wasn't willing to let her carry it that way. Voss looked at her. He was right about that, wasn't he? She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said. He was. Voss nodded. He moved toward the door. Write the report, Lieutenant. Change the pipeline. The rest will follow from that. He paused at the door. Fort Ravenwood's evaluation results will be posted at 1700. You passed. Top of the cycle. He said it as a fact, not a ceremony. Not that it was ever really the point. He walked out. She stood alone in Reed's office for 30 seconds, which was how long she allowed herself before she walked back out into the corridor and into the particular quality of afternoon that follows something permanent. Hargrove was waiting in the corridor. She had not told him to wait. He had simply stayed. He looked at her face and read what was on it with the accuracy of a man who had spent 3 days learning her tells. He said, Good or complicated? She said, Both. Same as everything that matters. He nodded. The team is in the mess hall. Chen found coffee that's actually drinkable, which he considers a major achievement. Vossauers, not whoever you were just talking to, is apparently very invested in making sure Ortega eats something before the results post. She said, Ortega never eats when he's processing. I know. That's why Voss is invested. She looked at him. How much did you hear through Reed's door? He looked back at her evenly. Not a word. Soundproofing in that corridor is excellent. She held his eyes. He said, I heard your name. And then Voss said something I couldn't make out, and then it was quiet for a long time. What did you think was happening? Hargrove was quiet for a moment. I thought, whatever it is, she's handling it, and I thought I hope when it's over she comes back out here instead of just heading to wherever she's going next. He paused. I'm glad you came back out here. She said, Dominic. He blinked. She had used his first name exactly once in 3 days. She said, You're going to be asked to be part of the reform process. Not today. In the next few weeks, you'll receive a request to serve on an advisory panel for assessment architecture review. When you receive it, say yes. He stared at her. How do you know? Because you caught the Ravenwood flaw yourself, she said. You've known for 2 years something was off. You compensated for it in your own team leadership without being able to name what you were compensating for. That makes you exactly the kind of inside voice the reform needs. She met his eyes. Say yes. He said, Are you asking me or telling me? I'm telling you, but I'm telling you because I'm asking. He said, Yes. Then, I was going to say yes before you finished the sentence. She started walking toward the mess hall. He fell into step beside her. He said, "What happens to the program, Ravenwood?" "It changes," she said. "Not immediately. Change at this level is measured in cycles, not days. But it changes." Reed leads the change. That was always going to be the right answer. "And you?" She was quiet for a moment. "I write a report." He said, "Just a report." She said, "Never just anything." He accepted this. They walked into the mess hall and the team looked up simultaneously. 6 faces turning toward her with the particular quality of attention that people give to someone they have decided over 72 hours of high-pressure proximity to trust with something real. Chen said, "Coffee is drinkable today. I want full credit for finding that." Reyes said, "He has been saying this for 20 minutes. We have all acknowledged it. He continues to bring it up." Chen said to Emily specifically, "I feel my contribution is being minimized." She sat down. She took the cup of coffee. Sergeant Voss, who had spent an hour ensuring Ortega ate something and was now looking at Emily with the direct, uncluttered attention of someone waiting for information handed her. Ortega said, "Results at 1700. "Results at 1700, she confirmed. Webb said, "And after that," she looked around the table. She looked at all of them, at Hargrove, who had made a deal with her on the first morning and honored it at every breaking point. At Chen, who had been young and open enough to let what he saw change him. At Reyes, who had run at 100% once she stopped spending 40% watching someone else. At Voss, who had backed a call at exactly the right moment without being asked to explain it. At Ortega, who had named the logistics gap out loud without waiting for permission and whose face had carried for the rest of the exercise the quiet confidence of a man who has discovered that the thing he's been waiting for permission to do is the exact thing the room needed. At Webb, who had laughed on the first morning and who had asked 2 days later about the teams that followed the false orders, not for himself, but for them. She said, "After that, this team gets dispersed across regular rotation assignments. And the work you did here, the specific way you worked, the decisions you made, the answer you gave at the end, that's going to matter in ways that you won't be able to trace back to this week, because that's how institutional change works. It moves through people, not paper." Voss said, "Is that enough?" The table went quiet, because it was the question, wasn't it? Not the logistical question of what comes next, but the real one. The question of whether a week's worth of genuine effort, most of which would be invisible in any official record, was enough to justify what it had cost. Emily looked at Voss. She said, "Ask the sergeant from Team 4, who told us this morning that our flag on the authentication code was why his team checked theirs." Voss considered this. "He doesn't know what else happened this week." "No," Emily said. "And he doesn't need to. He needed the flag on the authentication code. We gave him that without knowing we were giving it. It worked the same way whether we knew or not." Reyes said, "That's either very reassuring or very unsettling." Emily said, "It's both. Same as everything that matters." Hargrove looked at her. She had said that twice now to him in the corridor, and now to the table. He filed it as something she meant, which meant it was something she had already paid for. At 1700, the evaluation results posted. Team 9 placed first overall. Hargrove's name appeared at the top of the individual assessment results. Reyes was third. Chen was fifth. Every member of Team 9 ranked in the top 8 of the evaluation cycle. And at the bottom of the results page in the comment field that Colonel Marcus Reed had never used in 11 years of posting evaluation results. There were 2 lines. "This cycle's evaluation has been formally flagged for program review. The final team response submitted by Team 9 has been forwarded to program oversight as foundational documentation for assessment architecture reform. Details to follow in next cycle briefing." That was all. In the mess hall, Chen read it and looked up. He said, "He put it in the official record." Hargrove said, "Of course he did." Webb said, "That's he put it in the official record." "Yes," Emily said, "he did. She thought about a man who had known for 7 years that something was wrong and had compensated for it in silence, running embedded tests that the scoring system couldn't capture, looking for something he had started to believe the system was no longer capable of producing. She thought about what it cost to carry that knowledge in an institution that required you to defend the thing you were trying to change. She thought about Reed's face when he looked at her from the observer platform at the end of the exercise, the nod that was not ceremony but recognition, and she thought he was not waiting to be saved. He was waiting for a moment when he could finally say what he already knew to people with the standing to hear it and the authority to act on it. She thought sometimes a person's greatest contribution is not what they do. It is what they make possible for someone else to do. She thought about 12 people who came home from a mission that the official record described in sanitized language and that the internal record described accurately, and that the third document produced 6 months later described as it actually was. She thought about a reprimand that had sat on her record for 3 years and that had been replaced at 0830 that morning with the full truth of what had happened. She thought about a man in a forward operating unit who had filed a review request and not told her because he knew she would have told him it wasn't necessary, and because he had decided on her behalf that it was. She thought the debt runs in both directions, and I have been so focused on what I owe the system that I forgot to account for what the system owed me. The mess hall emptied gradually. The team dispersed by ones and twos, not dramatically without the ceremony that the movies would have given this moment, without the long look and the meaningful handshake. Just people ending an evening the way people end evenings in the ordinary way, which was, she had always believed, the truest way. Webb was the last to leave. He stopped beside her and said, "For what it's worth." She waited. He said, "First morning, formation. I was wrong, and I knew it by the end of the first day. And I didn't say so at the time because..." He stopped. "I don't have a good reason. I had a reason. It wasn't good." She said, "You said so with the authentication code when you asked about the other teams." He frowned. "That was about the other teams." "Yes," she said. "That's what I mean." He worked through this. She watched him work through it. He was not a fast processor of emotional information. He was a fast processor of tactical information. And this was a different thing, but he was an honest one, and he got there. He said, "Okay." She said, "Okay." He left. She sat in the empty mess hall for a while. She thought about the report she would write. 6 months. Every program in the pipeline. The full scope of a problem that had been visible in its parts to many people and that had required someone willing to name the whole thing in a room where naming it had a cost. She thought, "I know what this is. I have always known what this is. It is not about being right. It is not about being recognized. It is not about a reprimand removed or a commendation given or a name at the top of an evaluation result that nobody outside this base will ever see. It is about the 12 people who came home, and the people who will come home because the pipeline changes, and the people who will sit in rooms like the one she had sat in on Tuesday morning in front of people who have already decided what they see and who will survive that room because the system that assessed them was honest enough to look for what they actually were rather than what it expected. She thought about a 23-year-old named Chen who had learned in 72 hours to trust his first answer. She thought about an Ortega who had named the logistics gap without waiting for permission and whose face had changed in the naming. She thought about a Voss who had backed a call at exactly the right moment because someone had told her the right way what was needed. She thought about a Webb who had asked about the other teams. She thought this is what changes. Not the architecture first, the people first. And then the architecture because people who have changed build different structures than the people they were before. She stood up. She walked out of the mess hall and into the evening, and Fort Ravenwood was quiet around her in the way that places are quiet after something real has moved through them. Not empty, but settled the particular stillness of a space that has been used for its actual purpose and knows it. She thought about Tuesday morning, the formation, the laughter, the 200 soldiers who had already decided what they were looking at before they looked. She thought about position 7. Reed had moved her to position 7 because he wanted to watch her. He had told himself it was standard evaluation positioning. It wasn't. She thought he moved me where he needed me before he knew he needed me there. She thought that's the thing about people who are good at what they do. Sometimes they're right for reasons they haven't articulated yet. She walked the perimeter of the base in the dark, the same walk she had taken the night before the final exercise when she had decided to stop being careful and let the full weight of what she knew land on the people who needed to feel it. She thought I made that decision alone in the dark, and I walked back to the barracks and slept 4 hours and woke up to find that the decision had already started making itself true while I was asleep. She thought that is how it always works when you do it right. You make the decision fully, and then you sleep, and then you wake up and do the work, and the decision and the work together produce something that neither of them could have produced alone. She stopped walking. She stood in the dark and understood with the particular completeness that comes after 72 hours of sustained intensity that she was not the same person who had walked onto this field on a Tuesday morning while 200 soldiers laughed at what they saw. Not because what they saw had changed, because what she had been carrying alone and in silence for 3 years was no longer hers alone to carry. The reprimand was gone. The record was true. The work was just beginning. And for the first time in a very long time, Lieutenant Emily Carter walked back toward the lights of Fort Ravenwood without the particular weight of a person who is doing the right thing in a system that has not yet decided to agree, because the system slowly, imperfectly, with all the friction and resistance that institutions bring to the act of becoming better than they were, had begun. Not because she had asked it to, because she had given it no other honest choice.